So now we have the second lecture of Stewart CLELLAND, who is a school teacher from Scotland. He studies his MA at Exeter University in Western esotericism. His research interests focus on Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, and he has published widely in Masonic journals across the world. He's going to speak about Scotland and Freemasonry.
Well, good evening, everyone. I must start by way of apology and say that the following paper assumes some kind of familiarity with the spiritual tradition known as Freemasonry, the spiritual fraternity with Solomon's temple as its central point of symbolism. It also assumes some kind of familiarity with British history. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to elaborate on the vast history of both. Rather, I present a small corner that I hope will be of interest to you. It is my hope that this paper will act as a counterpoint and indeed complement some of the previous presentations that we've already received that highlight the tradition of Anglo-Israelism. Of course, the United Kingdom is a kingdom made up of 4 separate kingdoms, and my paper today will focus on one of them, the Kingdom of Scotland. And I'm going to try and describe or present an idea of Scottish Israelism, or more specifically, a Masonic Scottish Israel tradition. When one delves into the murky business of Masonic research, Scotland's role is ubiquitous and yet entirely ambiguous. Indeed, some see it in a political sense or a religious sense, whilst others focus on Scotland's geographical role as historical fact. And for some, it is merely a label to identify variant, complex Masonic traditions. This complexity arises due to Scotland's role as a historical, geographical, and conceptual component within the different periods of Masonic tradition. The following paper is an attempt to understand it only insofar as it can be understood conceptually as a bridge of sort between 17th century Rosicrucianism and later 18th century high-grade continental Écossais Freemasonry. What's important to bear in mind in this paper is that I'll be talking about Freemasonries rather than one complete cohesive tradition. And particularly, we're going to be looking at continental and French Freemasonry that terms itself Écossais. The origins of this Écossais label are not clear. No one is yet to find out the true meaning of why that was adopted. Today, I'm going to try and suggest some kind of solution to that. It is a difficult idea to pin down, one that is often subject to ridicule, dismissal, or even hostility. Yet when Freemasonry's most recurrent themes are laid out, Scotland and Rosicrucianism are evident throughout. Therefore, if we were, for instance, to begin by denying outright the intellectual validity of the Rose Cross and the craft, as Freemasonry is sometimes referred to, and their marvellous claims to antiquity, prophecy, and intrinsic mystery, as portrayed in the primary texts themselves, by this I mean the ritual and catechisms, thereby adopting the positive reductionist or empirical historical stance of explaining the links by merely external means, such as political, economic, or environmental, is this indicative of the kind of academic neuroticism or intellectual insincerity renowned academic Arthur Vallouis claims it to be? How important is it to dialectically understand Scotland as both a Masonic idea or ideal and or an empirical truth? There is evidence to suggest that Scotland may have been portrayed as a Masonic spiritual counterpart to Jerusalem among some Freemasons of 18th century continental Europe, a kind of mythic and ritualized Solomonic kingdom. The following paper will look at how, for some authors, such as David Stevenson, Scotland is a purely historical consideration, while for others, Scotland is a romantic idea, an orientation, as it were, that is perhaps more comparable with the familiar Masonic concept of the East, or looking towards the spiritual East. For more than 290 years, a particularly fine and persistently evocative rumour has existed. This rumour was first expressed by the Scottish Presbyterian minister James Anderson in his Constitutions of 1723, and states that the revival of the royal art of Masonry in England was instigated by King James VI of Scotland, who, being a Mason king, revived the English lodges. Such is the enduring allure of the rumour that its tradition can by no means be considered the sole preserve of Anderson's alone. As we shall see, there has been many a less than sober historian since so inclined to chase the prize of the Mason's idol of origin, and more than most have found it wanting, or indeed in Scotland. This question of King James as a Mason king is an inquiry still open to some, yet in light of and in lack of a modern scholarship, it remains here best left as an eloquent but anecdotal folly. On the other hand, however, the singular importance of Scotland's rumoured role in the early foundations of Freemasonry have of late been given considerable academic credence, and as such are of particular interest to ourselves. In the predominantly, and as Scottish historian David Stevens suggests, distinctly Anglo-centric secondary scholarship, the origins of Freemasonry are typically found in the assertion of the importance of the Grand Lodge of England, founded in 1717, which would be 300 years this year, and two, with the important role of figures such as Elijah Asmold. In contrast, Davison's pivotal work, The Origins of Freemasonry, reject this position, highlighting the extraordinary wealth of primary documentary evidence for the early origins of Freemasonry in Scotland, with an almost complete absence in England. Drawn particular attention to figures such as William Shaw, who was a Master of Works and General Warden to King James, along with his famous statues of 1598 and 1599, Stevenson presents what is considered by many the strongest case yet for the legitimacy of Freemasonry's rumoured 17th century Scottish, Stewart, and possibly even Hermetic origins. His evidence for these claims of Scottish Masonic preeminence is indeed compelling, often challenged only on rather flimsy yet interestingly semantic fronts. His case is one built on what Stevenson refers to as the many Scottish Masonic firsts, i.e. the earliest use of the word lodge in a modern sense, earliest official minute books, earliest reference to the Mason's word, which is shorthand for the secret esoteric knowledge of the Freemasons, and the earliest Masonic catechisms. Suggesting that the first Shaw statues were based on the old 14th and 15th century Masonic ordinances known as Old Charges, David R. Dixon's book, The Tessera of Attila, essentially reflects the central themes of Stevenson's research by detailing how Shaw was the first to formalize Scottish Freemasonry and endowed it with new stature and meaning. Margaret C. Jacobs' book, Living the Enlightenment, does the same. She states that William Shaw was imbued with the reforming and mystical Hermeticism of the late Renaissance. It is this imbued mystical Hermeticism that both Jacob and Stevenson suggest generated a later affinity between Scottish, or rather Écossais, French Freemasonry and the German mystical current known as Rosicrucianism. This perceived affinity is central to our paper, particularly within the surprisingly conceptual complexity of its Scottish context. For we be brethren of the Rosy Cross, we have the Mason's word and second sight. Composed sometime around the early 17th century, Henry Adamson's poem, The Muses Threnodii, is described by David Stevenson as the first ever surviving reference to the Mason's word. 1638, the earliest notion or allusion to an esoteric tradition within Scotland. This poem was posthumously published at the behest of the author's influential brother, James Anderson. The Muses Threnodii first entered the printing presses of the King James College in Edinburgh in the same year as the rise of the radical Protestant Covenanters movement, in the same month as the signing of a very important and historic document known as the National Covenant. Stephen suggests that the significance of this appearance of the Mason's word in this rather unlikely poem lies with the fact that for him it represents the central evidence of esoteric activities happening within the Masonic lodges at this time. These supposed esoteric activities are happening during the time in which James VI is intent on having the forms of worship in the Scottish Church the same as those of the Church of England. James had ordered a General Assembly in Henry Adamson's hometown of Perth in 1618 to approve what comes to be known as the 5 Articles of Faith, one of which decreed that worshippers kneel when they received bread and wine at communion. The Scottish people disliked the articles, and it is believed that in practice they were not strictly enforced. After James's death, his son Charles I authorised a book of canons that made him head of the church and enforced the use of a new liturgy, commonly seen in Scotland as an English-style prayer book. In the resulting rebellion, the Scottish bishops were expelled from the church, and representatives of various sections of the Scottish population, and in imitation of the ancient Hebrew covenant, signed this national covenant, binding themselves under God to a form of radical Protestantism, the Scottish Presbyterian Kirk. It's important here to point out that for some people, the Scottish and the ancient Hebrews are the only 2 groups to have signed a covenant under God. And this has a lasting influence for later perceptions as Scotland as a Masonic spiritual counterpart to Jerusalem. Now, in the midst of such radicalism and zealotry, Stevenson concedes that what membership of a Scottish Masonic lodge in the 17th century meant is obscure. But he insists that nearly all that is known of the secrets and rituals of the Scottish Masons in the 17th century are derived from the Masonic catechisms. Much as Stevenson's evidence for the ritualistic importance of the 17th century Mason's word is found in later sources, such as the Edinburgh Registry House manuscript. This manuscript explains the form of giving the Mason's word, as well as elaborating on the grand secret of giving the Mason's word, providing some questions that Masons use to put to those who profess to have the Mason's word. Stevenson's famous work, The Origins of Freemasonry, presents the Mason's word as a fundamentally esoteric component in the Scottish Masonic tradition. Yet, it is true that his attempts to clarify the actual supposed esoteric nature of the 17th century Mason's word are a bit disappointing. He does point to remarks made again at the tail end of the century by an eccentric antiquarian Presbyterian minister known as Robert Kirk. He states, "The Mason's word, which some make a mystery of it, I will not conceal a little of what I know. It is like a rabbinical tradition, in a way a comment on Jachin and Boaz, the 2 pillars erected in Solomon's temple, with an addition of some secret sign derived from one hand to another, by which they know and become familiar with one another." Appearing late in the century, Robert Kirk's comments illustrate the word was understood as a secret method of making the unseen become seen, a method by which the Masons become familiar to one another. Kirk's comments are followed by the first ever known reference to a Freemasonic handshake, delivered from hand to hand. Limited in the information they provide, his comments do go some way to helping substantiate Stevenson's claim of the word's locally perceived esoteric power of invisibility. We must consider the Muses Tridonidae and its connection between Freemasonry, described as the Mason's word, and Rosicrucianism, the Rosicross, at such an early stage is significant, especially so in Scotland. Johann Bull connected Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism in his Über den Ursprung in 1804. This is then repeated by the famous English opium eater Thomas de Quincey in an issue of the London Magazine in 1824. While we can hardly accept these assertions as conclusive, we do know, due to the important work of Adam MacLean, that in 1612, Michael Meyer, the great Rosicrucian apologist, had sent King James if we remember Anderson's Masonic King, a rather interesting document. Described as a message of Christmas greetings, this 3 foot by 2 parchment document depicts a rose of 8 petals. The image, made up of Latin phrases, reads, "Greetings to James, for a long time King of Britain. By your true protection, may the rose be joyful." Susan Ankerman's book, Rose Over the Baltic, suggests that during this period, that is 1620 to 1660, Rosicrucianism was indeed exploited to justify certain political causes, namely the Stewart claim to the British throne. Ankerman explains that Maya is pledging that Eros must replace Eris, the goddess of discord. She elaborates on this by saying that this is a political movement by Maya, and that Maya's exhortation in gold and red ink reads, "May the rose not be gnawed by the canker nor by the north wind." This is what Lewis may term a positive reductionist approach towards Scotland's role in relationship to Rosicrucianism. By this I mean political. In addition, we might consider Donald Dixon's Tessera of Attila that explains how Rosicrucian manuscripts circled widely in Britain, and yet the first English printed edition was Thomas Vaughan's The Fame and Confessions of the Fraternity, or R.C. Under a pseudonym, Vaughan states that the manuscripts were communicated to me by a gentleman more learned than myself. I should name him here, but he expects not either thy thanks nor mine. Dixon suggests that this gentleman was likely Sir Vaughan's patron, Sir Robert Murray. Sir Robert Murray, an important figure in Stevenson's thesis, had married the daughter of Sir David Lindsay, Sophia Lindsay, in 1647. Lindsay is known as a collector of rare alchemical and Rosicrucian manuscripts. Murray would have had access to the manuscripts through his marriage, and therefore was one of the most prominent Scottish Masons at the time. Furthermore, he had been initiated, one of the earliest known initiations, on the 20th of May 1641 by the Edinburgh Lodge on a visit to Newcastle. Again, what we have here is an example of the relationship between Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and Scotland in the empirical historical sense, as in a political, an economic, and environmental sense. Both Ankerman and Dixon are able to convincingly place aspects of 17th century Rosicrucianism in the same historical context as Stevenson presents Freemasonry. So this is the idea that Scotland as a historical, actual place for the origins of Freemasonry come from these details. For others, it is more a romantic ideal. In common with the Scottish craft, it was within the tumultuous first half of the 17th century that Rosicrucianism became concrete in text, that is, at first in some manifestos and a novel, then in a very large number of pseudepigraphic writings. These Rosicrucian texts, themselves representative of what must be considered here as 17th century Rosicrucianism in its historical actuality, have as their origin the explosive appearance of a 1614 bound volume of works coming out of Kassel, Germany, that is of such singular importance that eminent scholars such as Francis Yates have seen fit to describe in terms more akin to an enlightenment, a Rosicrucian enlightenment. The volume composed of 3 tracts, the universal and general reformation of the whole wide world, the Fama Fraternitatis, or the fame of the fraternity, and also a short response by one Adam Hasselmeyer. Such was the popularity of the volume that a year later, in 1615, a new edition appears, where the replacement of the universal and general reformation of the whole wide world, itself a satirical extract, and the new edition now included the second Rosicrucian manifesto, known as the Confessio Fraternitatis. Now, the resulting mass of responses is indeed somewhat notable. Thanks in no small part to the peerless work of Carlos Gilly, we now know that between 1614 and 1620, more than 200 different replies were published, both for and against the movement in response to these original manifestos, giving rise to what has been known as the Rosicrucian Furore. This number is said to increase to 900 by the time of the 19th century. Yet, in the 21st century, as we move towards the 400th anniversary of the publication, we now know of only 4 original German 17th century manuscripts of the Fama to have survived. 2 are in the library of the Wellcome Institute in London, 1 in the University Archive in Salzburg, 1 is in the Herzog August Library in Württemberg, and of the English translations, Adam MacLean identifies only a few surviving 17th century manuscripts. The first is a manuscript mentioned that belonged to the Scottish nobleman Sir David Lindsay, the Earl of Buckhurst, who also published a translation of the Fama in the Scots dialect. The Lindsay manuscript is dated 1633 and is now in the Crawford collection in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh. Secondly, the manuscript from Sir David Lindsay appears to have made his copy. This is in the library of the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh. Now, of these 2 Scottish manuscripts, one belonged to George Erskine of Interteal. At the beginning is inscribed an epitome of architecture and makes some passing references to Freemasons. It also contains the Fama Fraternitatis in Scots dialect, and the writing is probably Erskine's. Within the manuscript is a full version of a Rosicrucian document known as the Sceptum Socovium Rhodostraticotum, 1618, sorry for the pronunciation. And this takes up about 34 pages of the total, 664 pages of the document. The German has been Latinized, and the manuscript includes crude drawings of these original famous plates. As Christopher Mackintosh states, it would appear from this that Scotland played an important and possibly key role in the early development of Rosicrucianism. Furthermore, he states that we know Rosicrucian elements did in fact become attached to Freemasonry in the 18th century in the form of what's known as a Rose-Croix Masonry. It's within this tradition that we start to see both Rosicrucianism and Scotland become a Masonic ideal. Now, as Scotsmen pushing what their critics at the time believe to be tartan-clad romances of Scottish and Stewart Masonic origins, neither Anderson nor Stevenson can be said to stand alone. The enigmatic figure known as the Scottish Chevalier Andrew Michael Ramsay, whose own traditional history, erroneously but universally referred to as his oration of 1736, might be viewed as another decisive, if somewhat farcical, moment in this later, distinctly continental 18th century idea of Scotland as a Masonic counterpart to Jerusalem. The connection that was viewed between Scotland and Rosicrucianism, and of course the Stuart cause. We have to remember in the 18th century the Jacobite cause and the Stuart Bonnie Prince Charlie. This whole mythology started to tie in with ideas of the Stuart family being a Davidic line, a line of Solomon, divinely ordained to be the king of Great Britain, with Scotland being seen somewhat as Judea and England as Israel. And this was a uniting of a great country between under the Stuart cause. Now, with that, you also have the aspect of the Scottish people signing the biblically inspired National Covenant. This now gets inflated more and more with the introduction of the Crusader myth, the senior Crusader myth in Freemasonry, that after being condemned by the Catholic Church, the Knights Templar had no place to go in Europe but Scotland, as Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated and made their way to Scotland. And in certain myths, the Knights Templar helped Robert Bruce fight the English at Culloden. Within France, this became a major myth and something that when we are investigating Scottish involvement in the origins of Freemasonry becomes important. So, to conclude, what I would say is that when we come to look at Freemasonry, it is important to understand Scotland's place either as an ideal or an actual reality. This was mentioned in an earlier talk about when does Jerusalem mean Jerusalem? when you look at Masonic research, when does Scotland mean Scotland? Thank you.